Scotland's highest civil court has now ruled, as you will have heard during the week, that the UK government acted lawfully in blocking some quite absurd legislation from Hollywood's controversial gender reform bill, which became as much a constitutional issue as it was a gender issue, both pretty crucial topics. And essentially, the UK government, i.e. Westminster, overruled a decision by Scottish MPs. And so you've got the Greens and the Independence Party thinking how awful this is and an insult to democracy when it's exactly the devolution rules they signed up to. And actually a lot of relieved people that the gender reform bill has actually been blocked and taken off the statute book. Of course, they can still appeal, the SNP, if they choose to. That is down to Humza Yousaf to decide. To join me to discuss this, Susan Smith, who is co-director of For Women Scotland, is a group of Scottish women looking to strengthen women's rights, which, let's face it, have come under a lot of attack with much of this gender talk. Susan, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me. So can you give us a little bit of perspective? What would this bill have meant, first of all?
Well, what the Scottish Government wanted to do was to strip out any sort of safeguards or any process involved in getting hold of a gender recognition certificate. And that would have meant that people could have just self-declared, said they wanted to change their legal sex and got a certificate without going through any process at all. And what we found out in another ruling, our ruling, which we took to judicial review, was that getting one of these certificates does change your right of access to certain services and spaces. And we may yet appeal that. We don't know where we stand at the moment, but it's clear it was a significant thing to do. And it was going to make a big difference to a lot of women if any man, for any reason whatsoever, including nefarious ones, could do this.
Now, it was essentially blocked by the Scottish Secretary of State on the grounds of, not that it's necessarily a threatening bit of legislation, but it would have produced inequality between, if you like, rules between Scotland and the UK that would have been unequal and unfair. And the court in Scotland has said, yes, this is absolutely the case. Hence, they've blocked it. So politically, I have to ask you, this was the now rather challenged Nicola Sturgeon's big idea. Humza Yousaf has protested and said, isn't it awful this has happened? But do you think they actually, the SNP, have an appetite to pursue this ridiculous bill?
It's a really interesting question. I think some of them do, because some of them are really ideologically committed to this. I'm not sure whether Humza Yousaf is. It would be a really stupid thing to pick a constitutional fight on, because it's really unpopular in Scotland, and there's absolutely no doubt in most people's minds that this was a fair ruling, because this does impact wider UK equality law. If this was allowed to happen in Scotland, this would impact the rest of the UK as well. So if we are still part of a devolved system of government, then there are checks and balances in place. There are things that the Scottish Government is not allowed to do. I think a lot of SNP MSPs and MPs are cautious that we might be having a run up to a general election soon. And is this really something they want to be fighting an election on, this incredibly unpopular bill? And you've probably seen images of people like the double rapist Isla Bryson, and they really will not want to have questions asked about that. The people who do want to fight it, of course, are the Scottish Greens.
Who are, I should say, are partners of the SNP, of course.
That's right. They're in a coalition. The Butte House Agreement, which was their coalition deal that Nicola Sturgeon set out, this was part of it. It was a key part of it. I think it's highly probable that the Scottish Government will not appeal it. And so that will then pose a question for the Scottish Greens. Do they walk and give up their ministerial positions, or do they swallow this?
Yes, I mean, the Greens, just to read out, they're nothing like a drama for the Greens on this. They said of the verdict, this was a devastating day for equality and democracy. I think you'd probably say the complete opposite there, I suspect, and,
Yes.
and went on to say, it is a democratic outrage, crushing basic rights and equality for some of Scotland's most marginalised people. One of your points that I think is hopelessly overlooked in this debate on this issue, not particularly this bill, is, of course, there seems to be a general of acceptance that we don't have to protect many women's hard-fought-won rights over decades.
Yeah.
I mean, am I right in saying this doesn't seem to touch a nerve with many people? I think it's hugely significant.
It is hugely significant. And I think we have seen a bit of a revival in the women's movement, especially in Scotland, because this has been such a big deal. It took a lot of people by surprise, because I think people thought these rights were won, we'd fought for them, we got there, they were solid. And then all of a sudden you realise how quickly they can be taken away. And of course, a lot of these changes happen
in the name of equality. In the name of
name
equality.
yes.
It's extraordinary juxtaposition.
Yeah, and a lot of this happened by stealth. You know, suddenly we found out that they'd rewritten prison policy, that rape crisis centres were operating on the basis of self-ID, that the NHS were changing people's sex markers on their records. And all of this had happened without a public debate, without any sort of conversation. And I think a lot of us came to this thinking, OK, if this is a good argument, let's have the discussion and make your case. And what we found certainly over the past 5 years since For Women Scotland's been in existence, is that they really don't have arguments. And that was why it was introduced really below the radar, so that people wouldn't notice, I think. But it is terrifying, the assault on women's rights.
And where do you think this goes next? I mean, you've said you don't think that they will do it, but it might force a breakup. I think anyone who is brave enough to make a forecast in political issues all these days and all this time. Let me put this to you. That one alternative, which would be a nice political, neat move to do, is to say, we're not going to pursue this. It's already cost $250,000, but we're going to seek a mandate at the next Scottish elections or the general election or whatever they may do. Do you think that they might try and slip it in that way? Because, let's be honest, not everyone reads manifestos, do they?
That's true, they don't, but the SNP obviously have been on a bit of a slide in the polls. Scottish Labour have been doing better. So I think if they, and this is a very unpopular measure, and I think that they might find it backfired on them if they did, because, you know, we're not going to go anywhere, and there are still lots of issues within Scotland. We've just had this appalling prison policy came out this week. So that they spent 5 years reviewing the prison policy, and they've actually made very few changes to it. They've said that violent men who've attacked women will not be placed in the first instance in a woman's prison if they self-identify as women, but they might be after they've been risk assessed.
That is extraordinary.
It is.
Well, thank you for sharing us with that. I was completely unaware of that. Can I ask you just one final question? Did you get considerable political support from other parties, or did they all not want to go there?
No, I think increasingly we did. Obviously, the Scottish Conservatives, most of them voted against this. A couple of them voted for it, but most of them have been very much opposed and been very strong on it. We have had support from individual MSPs within Labour as well. I think Labour were whipped, and I think they would probably admit to themselves that was a mistake. And obviously within the SNP, there were was it the 9 rebels who voted against it, as well, of course, as people like Joanna Cherry in Westminster, who've been extremely strong on it, and Ash Reagan, of course, resigned her ministerial position. So, yeah, it's caused more divisions, I think, within political parties than anything else has for a while. And I think that's why they maybe realise it's a bad idea.
Well, my hope is that Humza Yousaf should stop fighting this hopeless cause and thank his lucky stars. The judges might have saved him a bit of a problem. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss this afternoon. It's a really ludicrous situation, particularly that jail policy. I'm absolutely shocked about that they are still seriously considering placing transgender men into women's prisons, depending on how they risk assessment. We all know how bad risk assessments are in this country.